Welcome to this deep dive. Today we're really getting into one of the biggest, most complicated partnerships in tech right now. That's the one between OpenAI and Microsoft.
It's definitely a fascinating one, constantly evolving.
Exactly. So our mission really is to figure out how it all started, this powerful team up, and look at the deep tech connections they built. But then also try to understand where it's going now. Because things seem to be shifting, right? What looked like total synergy maybe isn't quite so simple anymore.
Yeah, there's definitely some strategic pulling apart happening, it seems.
And you really have to start with the money. Microsoft's initial bet was just
Oh, enormous. Over $13 billion.
$13 billion. It's hard to even wrap your head around that number.
It really is. And it wasn't all at once, remember. It started with $1 billion back in 2019.
Right.
Then another $2 billion by 2021, and then the really big one, $10 billion in 2023. Massive.
So why? Why put that much money in? What was Microsoft's play?
You could definitely call it Microsoft's pick and shovel play for the AI gold rush. They weren't necessarily digging for the AI gold themselves, not directly anyway, but they were positioning themselves to supply the essential tools, the infrastructure, to the ones who were digging.
Okay, so they provide the tools. What about OpenAI? What did they get apart from, well, a giant pile of cash?
That cash was obviously important, but maybe even more critical was getting access. Access to Microsoft's Azure data centers. That was absolutely key.
Because building these huge AI models takes massive computing power.
Exactly. You just can't build or train things like GPT-4 or whatever comes next without that kind of heavy-duty infrastructure. Azure gave them the engine room they needed at the scale they needed it.
So Microsoft provided the picks, the shovels, and the land to mine on, essentially.
Yes, a good way to put it.
So what did Microsoft get back for all that, beyond just owning a piece of OpenAI?
They got a crucial front row seat right in the middle of the action. This partnership was their ticket to compete directly with, Google and others in this AI race that was heating up fast.
And initially, it sounds like it was really cooperative.
Oh, yeah. The early days were all about deep cooperation, strategic alignment. Both sides were really pushing each other forward.
And then there's OpenAI's structure, which is unusual, right? This capped profit thing.
Right. The for-profit company technically controlled by a non-profit board.
With this mission of, safe and beneficial AGI for everyone.
That's the official mission, yeah. But $13 billion, that buys you a lot of influence, doesn't it?
It has to.
Absolutely. It gives you significant leverage. So while the nonprofit board is theoretically the boss, reports suggest that, big decisions, major structural changes at OpenAI, they often need a nod from Microsoft.
So they're tied together pretty tightly, despite that nonprofit layer.
Effectively, yes. That money creates a very strong bond.
And it wasn't just money. The tech side was deeply intertwined, too, from really early on.
Oh, completely. Since 2016, basically. Yes. OpenAI went all in on Azure. It wasn't just like renting some servers. It was a full commitment.
How deep did that go?
Well, get this. Microsoft actually built them a dedicated supercomputer inside Azure back in 2020. Custom built just for OpenAI's massive training needs.
Wow.
Yeah. And doing that actually pushed Microsoft's own Azure capabilities, too. So it was a real technical win-win at the time.
A custom engine for their AI dreams. Yeah. That's serious commitment. You can see why OpenAI needed that, maybe even more than the cash itself.
Definitely. That infrastructure was foundational.
And Microsoft, they didn't hang about using OpenAI's tech, did they? They pushed it out pretty fast.
Incredibly fast. First, you saw the Azure OpenAI service pop up. That let businesses tap into the models.
Right, for enterprise customers.
Exactly. Then came GitHub Copilot.
Which was a genuine game changer for coding, wasn't it?
Totally. It really, really changed how developers work. Huge impact.
That seemed like the point where it went mainstream, almost. Showing how quickly this tech could change workflows.
Yeah, and Microsoft didn't stop there. Microsoft Copilot started appearing, everywhere. In Bing search, baked into Windows, across the whole Microsoft 365 suite word, Excel, Teams, you name it.
So for Microsoft, this was about more than just adding cool features.
Oh, much more. It was strategic. It created this powerful ecosystem lock-in. It made their whole suite of products much, much stickier, harder for customers to leave.
Okay, so it starts out looking like this perfect match. Huge investment, deep tech integration, mutual benefits. But relationships like this, especially in tech, they rarely stay simple. When did we start seeing the first signs of friction, the cracks appearing?
Well, you started hearing little things, murmurs, mainly around intellectual property, IP rights.
IP. Always a tricky area.
Always. especially when you have partners with potentially different long-term goals or philosophies.
Can you give an example of that IP tension?
Sure. Remember when OpenAI bought that coding startup, Windsurf, for reportedly like $3 billion?
They do, yeah.
Well, given how much Microsoft had invested, you might think Microsoft would expect to get access to Windsurf's IP too.
Makes sense.
But apparently OpenAI pushed back on that. They reportedly wanted to keep that specific IP separate.
Interesting. Why?
It kind of highlights a potential clash, right, between OpenAI's maybe more research-focused, open-ish roots and Microsoft's commercial interests. Where do you draw the lines on shared tech versus separate assets?
That definitely sounds like a sign of growing apart, or at least defining boundaries. And then there was another big signal. OpenAI started looking elsewhere for computing power, not just Azure.
Exactly. That felt like a real turning point. They started striking deals with Oracle, with CoreWeave.
And even Google Cloud, right? Microsoft's huge competitor.
Yes. Partnering with Google Cloud, that was significant.
What does that signal? After being seemingly all in on Azure?
It signals a very clear move away from exclusivity. Their compute needs just went through the roof. They basically outgrew what even Azure alone could provide, or perhaps what they wanted Azure alone to provide.
So they needed more power, basically.
Yeah.
For the next generation models.
Immense power. So it's partly practical, secure enough compute, but it's also strategic. Diversify your suppliers, reduce your dependence on any single one, even Microsoft, even if it means working with their biggest rivals.
Okay, so OpenAI is branching out, reducing its reliance on Azure. How did Microsoft react? Just let it happen.
Oh no, Microsoft's definitely not passive here. You could say they're building a fortress. They're actively developing their own internal AI capabilities.
You mean the MAI models we've heard about? Microsoft's own foundational models?
Precisely. They're essentially creating their own alternatives to OpenAI's tech, hedging their bets.
And they brought that team from Inflection AI too, didn't they?
Yeah, acquiring the Inflection AI team was a major move, a huge talent grab. It's all about building up their own internal strength, reducing that dependency on OpenAI, diversifying their AI portfolio.
So it looks like both sides are kind of preparing for a future where they might not be quite so intertwined. Or at least they want options.
It certainly looks that way, building parallel capabilities.
And then there was that whole reported debate, supposedly quite heated, between Sam Altman and Satya Nadella about defining AGI, artificial general intelligence. Why is nailing down that definition so critical for them?
It's absolutely vital because of the terms of their agreement. The deal apparently says that once OpenAI achieves AGI, whatever that means, according to their agreed definition, Microsoft might lose its exclusive access to the most advanced stuff.
Ah, okay. So the definition determines when Microsoft potentially loses that privileged access.
Exactly. So defining AGI isn't just philosophical, it's a massive strategic point. It dictates future control, future access, potentially billions in value. It's huge.
Wow, okay. And then, talk about defining moments. November 2023, OpenAI leadership crisis. That was just wild.
Absolutely wild. Came out of nowhere, seemed incredibly chaotic.
And what did it show us about the Microsoft relationship?
Well, it undeniably showed Microsoft's power, didn't it? Even though they didn't have a voting seat on the board at the time, their pressure, Satya Nadella's influence, was clearly instrumental, key, really, in getting Sam Altman brought back as CEO after he was suddenly fired.
So Microsoft flexed its muscles, showed its leverage.
They did. But there was cost. Reports from inside OpenAI suggested it really damaged trust. Irrevocably, some said.
That's the paradox, right? They secured their preferred outcome in the short term. Sam Altman back in charge.
Right. Solidified their practical influence.
But maybe at the cost of that long-term trust, that smooth partnership vibe. What do you think the fallout of that is? Does it make them wary of each other?
It almost certainly does. It must introduce an element of caution, maybe even suspicion. It could slow things down, lead to more siloed work, perhaps. Hard to say for sure from the outside.
It may be related to that or maybe to antitrust concerns. Microsoft later gave up its board observer seat, didn't they, in July 2024?
Yeah, they stepped back from that observer role. Could be partly optics, signaling a bit more distance, especially because the antitrust regulators have been sniffing around.
Right, the UK, Germany, the EU, they've all been looking closely at this relationship.
Exactly. Now, the EU decided it wasn't technically a merger, but just the fact that there is that level of scrutiny, that intense regulatory interest, it likely adds pressure on both sides.
Pressure to maybe loosen the ties a bit, demonstrate they aren't too cozy.
Precisely, to show they are distinct entities despite the deep connection.
Okay, so let's pull back a bit. We've seen the deep integration, the rising tensions, the power plays. What does all this mean for the wider AI industry? What are the big takeaways?
One clear thing is that cloud infrastructure is a huge battleground. OpenAI spreading its bets beyond Azure using Oracle, Google Cloud. That's a definite blow to Azure's exclusivity in that high-profile relationship. Microsoft has to adjust.
Makes sense. Competition heats up there.
And it really highlights this fundamental tension in how cutting-edge AI gets built. You absolutely need the enormous capital, the huge infrastructure investment that only giants like Microsoft can really provide.
The deep pockets and the computing power.
Exactly. But you also need the kind of innovation, the speed, the agility, sometimes the sheer disruptive thinking that often comes from more independent startups like OpenAI.
Startup energy?
How do you balance those two things? The massive resources versus the nimble innovation. It's the core dilemma.
And as this specific partnership evolves, maybe towards more competition, does that actually spur more innovation? Because now they're not just partners. They might be pushing against each other too.
That's a real possibility. Competition can be a powerful driver. It forces both Microsoft, with its internal efforts, and OpenAI to keep pushing the boundaries, perhaps even faster than before.
So the dynamic is just constantly shifting. It's never static. This whole story is not just about OpenAI and Microsoft, is it? It's about power, money, strategy, independence, the whole future of how AI gets developed.
Absolutely.
Which leaves us, and you listening, with a really interesting question to ponder, I think.
Yeah, what does this kind of relationship arc, starting as these incredibly tight partners, now seemingly moving towards maybe being rivals in some ways, what does that really tell us about the future of AI innovation? Particularly that balance we talked about. The big resource-rich companies and the fast, agile startups. How will that play out going forward? It's definitely something to keep watching.